In the name of the God who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen. Please be seated. Today, we hear a well-known story in the Gospel of Luke, what most of us know as the parable of the prodigal son. Thousands of artists have recreated this story to bring emphasis on the various perspectives in this rich example of radical grace. Most of you have probably seen a print of Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son, with the elder brother Pharisees and scribes looking on in the shadows. But whether depicting sons or daughters from the east or the west, this story strikes at the lived experience of every generation, and everyone from every generation has played the role of one of these siblings at one point in their lives, in a variety of settings, regardless if they have a biological sibling. When we really dig into the heart of what Jesus is saying in this story of radical grace, we find our God is not a God of retribution. God's intention is to restore us to wholeness, not destroy us. God does not follow our world's norms of fairness and just desserts, who's more favored and who's out, who's worthy and who's undeserving. We are also asked to look in the mirror to examine our own sense of self-righteous indignation and our refusal to forgive. This parable from Jesus doesn't just announce the good news, and it really is good news for all of us, but it vindicates it. We may know it as the parable of the prodigal son, but it is also a story of the prodigal father. For it is the father's actions that are equally as outrageous. Prodigal means wastefully extravagant or giving on a lavish scale. It is as if the father counters his son's shocking disregard for the father and what the Father has given him with an even greater abundance of love and forgiveness. We call that grace. We'll take a deeper look at what grace means in a minute. But then we have the elder son. Now, how many of you here today are the older child? Okay, I feel you. But whether or not you are the eldest in your family, you may have felt that you were the more responsible one. In our church and in our community, many of us have worked hard to be fine, upstanding members of our communities, and have therefore come to believe that we should be recognized as such, and that we deserve at least our share, if not more than those who have failed to live respectable lives. And we want to be the determiners of what is acceptable and respectable. In truth, we are both of these sons. Some of us can remember, even if we may try hard not to, when we have squandered our lives, lived recklessly, and abandoned our social or familial or cultural norms. Wasting what God has given us, we have at times flaunted our resolute determination to just live for ourselves. We have thrown caution and money to the wind in order to get what we want. And some of us have ended up with the pigs and wishing we even had as much as they did. We might call this hitting rock bottom. The thing about rock bottom, though, is that that can become the place where we start to find our way back home to our God. We either stay where we are or accept the way out of the pit. This youngest son found himself at the bottom, tending to pigs. And he decided to turn around and head back home, even though he believed he would no longer be a son. Even as a hired worker, he knew he was better off in the presence of the Father in any capacity than in the pigsty. When we find ourselves in the pig pen, may this parable encourage you that there is indeed good news and a path back to the loving arms of God that you do not need to earn, regardless if others tell you differently. Some of you may recall a time when you felt God's abundant grace and were forgiven when you didn't deserve it. And perhaps you longed to find a way where you could shape your life around that kind of good news. Once restored, it can sometimes be a tightrope of walking that line of remembering grace and not becoming so proud of your own virtue that you forget the time with the pigs. Neglecting to offer that same kind of grace to others whom you deem not worthy of it is a slap on the face of the Father. Now, the older son is also us. I mean, come on, he's done everything right. He did not abandon his father. He's out there working hard for a living, being a responsible citizen and respectful of his father, following all the cultural and social norms of what is expected from a Middle Eastern eldest son. And when the youngest son returns, that stuff the father is giving him, the fatted calf, the robe, the ring, that all belongs to the eldest son. The youngest squandered his share. And the audacity of the father to expect the son to join the celebration is just too much. Let us honestly admit, most of us agree with the eldest son's perspective. But Jesus really wants to drive this point home, that the grace of God is so radical and abundant that we would call it reckless and irresponsible. Let's go back to the beginning of our reading in Luke today. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." This would make us squirm a little. In Middle Eastern culture, it was more squirmy. But then our reading skips some verses to the prodigal son parable, but in between this statement and our parable today are two other parables, all making the same point. The parable of the lost sheep, where the shepherd goes after the one that is lost and leaves the other 99 hanging, although they are safe and secure. And the parable of the lost coin, where the woman gives all she has, but it's only 2 coins, so what value is that to us? This is God's grace, y'all. That those who are lost, marginalized, suffering from addiction, a stranger seeking shelter and safety in our neighborhood, and those who love people we think they shouldn't, are the ones God goes after to make sure they are brought into the fold, to make sure that what they offer is valued, and to make sure the extravagant love and grace of God is offered to everyone. And it's God's grace to still include the sullen and self-righteous son into this fold too. The word grace here in Luke means favor, a gift, something that is bestowed freely, a blessing. And it is from the same root word that means joy, providing a time to rejoice. To have grace in the way of Jesus is to be extravagant with our love and acceptance and not expect anything in return. To offer welcome without determining whether or not someone has earned it or is worthy of it. This tends to upset the faithful. And it is why the Pharisees and scribes, like us, were not at all happy that Jesus preferred to hang out and eat with ragamuffins. These parables describe what many who get called sinners are like. They're sick and needy. They're marginalized. They're vulnerable in a world that prizes power and religious righteousness. Jesus says that these outsiders understand God better than the religious insiders. They're the folks who we might see as those who eat with the pigs. They have so much to teach us about love, grace, and forgiveness. So much to offer, and we just can't imagine that. Despite this reckless giving of grace, the desire to bring everyone into the fold of God who we don't really want in our fellowship together, despite our looking on with anger and resentment like the older brother, that older brother and we are also given this same lavish love. We are all invited to the party. All the Father has is still ours too. Nothing has been taken away or will be taken away. Even when we think there will be less to go around, we are reminded that our God is a God of abundance. We have developed this ideology of scarcity to justify why we can't share with others. But there is always enough. Enough for the younger son, enough for the elder son, enough to go around for all. God throws a celebration for those who don't deserve it. We can refuse to go to the party because we don't like who's there, but we're always being called into the celebration. There is joy in grace. We can be mad at a God who welcomes home the unworthy, but our error is to not recognize that we are also missing the mark. We are also just as in need of this grace. When we get too comfortable and do not give or share our love extravagantly, we forget we actually need God. Our individual desire to have more than enough means we want to hold on tight to our stuff, our comfort, and our power. But the example of getting right with God, remember Lucinda Williams from last week? The example of getting right with God is not in how well we have done or how good of rule followers we are, but in the lessons we learn from those who've returned from the pigsty and know deep down in their very guts what it is to be welcomed home. Amen. Amen.